Welcome to Talking Digital Academy, the audio format for the Digital Academy organized by the Digital History Department at Bielefeld University. My name is Silke Schwandt. I am a professor for digital history at Bielefeld, and I am your host for this episode of our podcast. The Digital Academy is an annual online workshop with changing topics from the field of digital humanities. And in 2023, the Academy took place under the topic From Uncertainty to Action, focusing on phenomena of uncertainty in data-driven research. For a deeper dive into these phenomena, we had a special expert panel on our Open Space Day. This day's expert interviews form the basis for the 3 podcast episodes on this channel. This is the first episode, with Professor Jane Winters from the University of London as my guest. Jane Winters is Professor of Digital Humanities and the Director of the Digital Humanities Research Hub at the Institute of Historical Research at the University of London. Her research interests lie in the field of digital history, where she specializes in questions on born digital sources, and especially on digital archives and questions of archiving the 21st century. She is also interested in the use of social media by cultural heritage organizations, and especially in open access publishing. Jane Winters has co-directed a range of digital projects about the UK and Ireland, and is also the Vice President for Publications of the Royal Historical Society. Jane Winters puts emphasis on the fact that with different kinds of data come different kinds of uncertainties. Investigating these uncertainties does not mean searching for truths or facts, but for possibilities and interpretations. So let's hear her take on uncertainties in the context of digital humanities. I am very happy that you're here. Welcome, Jane Winters.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's delighted to be here.
Yeah, and I'm just going to lead us into this first half hour of interview. And maybe a question to warm up before we actually dive into the questions of uncertainty or uncertainty in data-related or data-driven research, and the questions of, what are we going to do with that? Maybe we can warm up with you telling us a little bit about your specific take on data, or maybe the data sets or the data constellations that you are dealing with in your particular research.
Very happy to. And I think the data that I work with depends on the research project a lot of the time. That the nature of my job, I end up working in different areas with different kinds of data, kind of learning from other people about how they think of data as well. But I think it's not surprising that as a historian, my starting point was text. And textual data is what I work with most often, although increasingly, I think, through working with other people, particularly in the cultural heritage sector, thinking about multi and transmedia as data and how we can start to work with that more effectively. There are 2 current areas of research for me. One's personal research, which is around the born digital archives that you mentioned, and the other is collections data, and specifically museums collections data in the context of a large research project. And one of the sort of wonderful but also really challenging things about web archives is, sure, there's lots of text in there, but there's everything else as well. You've got sound, still and moving image, 3D reconstructions. All of that is essentially in a large data bucket in a web archive, and trying to unpick what we've got, how it relates to everything else is a really interesting challenge. And I think we're still at the very early stages of web archive studies and thinking through how we can work with and conceptualize that data effectively. And the collections data side of things, I'm a co-investigator on a project led by the Science Museum Group, which is part of the UK's Towards a National Collection programme. And we are looking at connecting collections information across multiple institutions to tell industrial histories, specifically around textiles, communications and energy. So that's linking textual data again, but the data is about objects and there are images in those collections. And we're also starting to bring in film and oral history material, can we work with oral histories without turning them into text first for analysis, that kind of thing. So it's a real mixture, but I think text is my happy place. And the kind of method that speaks to me most in working with that information is scalable reading. I think that moving from the macro level to the micro level. And I think I'm increasingly interested in the bits in between as well, so that what's that mid layer like as well. And in relation to web archives, Niels Brugger conceptualizes that data and web archives as having 5 different strata that we need to move between as researchers. There's a web element, which might be an image on a page. There's a web page, the website itself, a web sphere, which might be a set of material related to a particular topic, like a general election, and then the web as a whole across the top, and trying to move backwards and forwards between those layers and bringing in our historians and humanities researchers' skills to interrogate that data is a really interesting approach for me to working with data at scale. And I think the programming historian, which many of you will be aware of, I'm sure, describes scalable reading really nicely, I think, and says that the analysis of the entire data set represents a range of contexts for close reading. And I think that's definitely the way that I like to approach things, although at heart I'm probably more of a qualitative researcher than a quantitative researcher, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving us this kind of broad overview of the questions relating to data, and also the impression that doing digital history or dealing with data from a humanities perspective kind of leads us into lots of different fields. I think many of us who are sort of active in that field, I myself, I am a trained medievalist. And of course, sort of medieval text is my happy place, so I can relate to that. But then being a digital historian, one is involved in lots of different projects because of the sort of the general questions that are being posed to us. So I think it's really good for you to give us this background, so that when we start thinking about the specificities of certain data sets or data types, and then of course our big topic in relation to the question of uncertain data, or more generally maybe what kinds of uncertainty do you encounter in your day-to-day work, or are there specific uncertainties or specific projects that are more uncertain than others? Not being really aware of the field, I would guess that sort of the web archiving project has more uncertainties, maybe for me particularly or personally, than a medieval text would have, but maybe that's just a personal impression. So yeah, what are the uncertainties that you deal with usually?
I think you're absolutely right, but it's fascinating, Silke. I'm also a medieval historian by training.
See?
I've moved quite a long way away from that, but started out 13th century forest court records, and have moved on from there. There's a lot of medievalists, I think from working producing editions and catalogues and calendars of information, it kind of led naturally into digital research. But I think my starting point with uncertainty is really that humanities researchers and historians, I don't think we're afraid of uncertainty, because it's the data that we work with is about people. It's messy, it's complex. People are uncertain and messy and complex, and so are the traces that we leave behind as we move through our lives. And our research questions come out of uncertainty often. We're not so much trying to prove something we think we already know, although that can be an approach, but it's exploring those uncertain spaces to just make things a little bit less uncertain sometimes. So I do think humanities researchers are very well placed to cope with the uncertainty that large volumes of data generate. We're not looking for truth and fact necessarily. We're looking for possibilities and interpretation, and I think that's what we really do bring to digital research. But you'll know this from your own experience, but that when you're sort of moving from analog to digital, as a medieval historian, you sometimes have to infer the existence of something from references to it in other documents because it doesn't exist anymore. And that's not hugely different, I think, from some of the uncertainties that we face when we're working with digital data. But you're absolutely right. I think it's the web archives that are the most challenging and uncertain. And it's a new primary source, really. We haven't been archiving the web for that long. It's since 1995, but the field of web archive studies is much more recent than that. So we're really still finding our way in working with this information. And if any of you have looked at early captures in the Wayback Machine at the Internet Archive, you are confronted immediately with what you don't have. So, and that for me, as a medieval historian, it's moving from being grateful that anything has survived at all, or isn't it great that we've got so much, to, oh, look what we don't have. So that confronts you straight away when you're working with those kind of digital sources. And they're also living archives in that they're not static. Data moves in and out of web archives all the time. That might be because somebody has issued a takedown notice. So what was previously publicly available is gone overnight. It's not taken out of the archive, but it's taken out of public access. That's a challenge if you're working on a piece of research and your sources suddenly disappear. But materials also added. I had a project where I was looking at an early special collection at the British Library, which has, you can only have on-site access. So I was looking at the same material on the Internet Archive. And a key website wasn't present in the special collection. It was referred to in lots of other places, but it wasn't there. A year later, it was, because the archive had been patched up with information from somewhere else. So that makes reproducibility a real problem working with this material, which is another element of uncertainty, I think. It's also true that an archived web page is not a true representation of something that any human person looked at online in real life. It's an artificial construct that is transformed by the archiving process into something different. And Niels Brugger describes that as reborn digital. We're taking a born digital object and turning it into something else. That brings in another area of uncertainty. It's not putting a document in an archive box and knowing that you're not affecting it in any way other than keeping it secure. It's actually transforming the object of research, which is something that we really need to get our heads around as a field, I think. And there's uncertainty about how the data's been collected as well, which I know is true for analogue sources sometimes as well, but there are no humans in the crawler loop, for example. So how does something end up where it ends up? We don't really know. That archival context is missing. So those are the kind of key kinds of uncertainty working with that material. But it's also there in the collections data that I'm working with. How do you identify that one object is the same as another object held somewhere else, or the same kind of thing, or that two people are the same person rather than people with the same name and similar contextual information? So it's there. It's all the way through, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. And also for sort of introducing the notion that historians, but I think also literary scholars, so lots of people from the humanities, are kind of used to dealing with something that we could frame as uncertainty. So, uncertain data, as you pointed out, but also ambiguity, to be unsure about something, I think is something that humanities scholars are dealing with all the time anyway. And that would really sort of be something that we bring to the digital sphere. But sort of going back to some of the things that you said, and adding onto that notion. So you said that, with the web archiving, of course, it's kind of similar to where things are missing. You don't know, you never have the full picture. But will you say that it's only a quantitative difference in uncertainty with sort of moving to the web and having all that kind of information and, sort of exponentially growing data collections? Or is it also a qualitative difference in sort of analog versus digital uncertainty, or uncertainty in analog versus digital data?
I think it's not entirely quantitative, but that scale issue really does bring in new problems and challenges. I think for one thing, it is harder to know what you don't have, because you don't know what you do have. So trying to identify where the gaps are, or even locate that uncertainty, is difficult. Colleagues working on a project at the British Library called Living with Machines have really brilliantly, I think, about getting to know the contours of your data before you can start doing anything with it. And that is something that you always had to know the kind of parameters of your sources when it's analog material, but I think understanding the shape of these vast digital archives is much more difficult. But I think An extra problem is around degrading data.
Mm-hmm.
Data not being fixed, being subject to degradation. And obviously physical archives can degrade. There's that cliche of a book doesn't survive if you leave it in the middle of a field, but it survives when it's carefully looked after in a library. And the Internet Archive had a fire in November 2013, so about 10 years ago now, in one of their scanning centres in San Francisco, and they lost a lot of equipment. 20 boxes of books and film, some of which was irreplaceable, but they didn't lose any data. So the idea that it's uniquely vulnerable, I don't think is right, but it is fragile and vulnerable and requires intervention in a way that physical archives don't, to make sure that we're not becoming increasingly uncertain about it and losing information. Provenance is harder to track and fix as well. The tools and platforms for accessing the data degrade too. So it's not just the sources, it's the tools that we're using and the equipment that we're using to work with them. So we've got these multiple levels of vulnerability and ephemerality built into the process in a way I think that isn't true for analogue material. And I also, there's this extra challenge, I think, of so much digital data being owned by commercial platforms that aren't archives. It's not their purpose. They don't think the way that archivists and researchers and curators would think about things, and that introduces additional uncertainty and fragility. We can't get to the parameters of that data because some of it's commercially sensitive, and it can disappear, and we can have no control over that happening. So I do think that the scale issue is key, but there are other things at play there as well. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does, and it also sort of raises awareness, and I think sort of raising awareness of the fact or the way that sort of digital archives come into being, how they exist, and how they are usually just there until they're not. I think that's a very important thing, and this could also be, like, especially for historians, I think a field where we could actually add or be engaged much more than we are maybe at the moment. So a field that is evolving now, and I know from one of our projects at Bielefeld University, where I work together with machine learning experts, that the whole question of archiving information, forgetting, keeping, that this is actually also a question that is really interesting for the more technologically focused people involved in sort of the whole digital data or digital world. So I think it's a really important, and I would agree or would read your answer also in that direction, to be more aware of all these different obstacles. But since we've talked about lots of challenges now, do you also see chances in this whole field of uncertain data that you would share with us?
Definitely. I mean, I think there are huge opportunities arising from uncertainty. And I mean, that's really, as I said at the beginning, that's where our research questions come from. We're trying to pin things down or give a little bit more certainty, or at least end up with a likelihood, and just increase the knowledge about particular areas in incremental ways as researchers. And it's that uncertainty and complexity and messiness that makes things interesting. Because we don't have, by and large, structured data. So you are inevitably going to be working with uncertainty to answer your most interesting research questions. And I think one of the key things for me about that as we approach research is being open about what we don't know, and being sensitive to what isn't there, not over-claiming for the research, which is sometimes something that quantitative research gets accused of kind of glossing over that uncertainty and trying to provide a simplified approach. Not always. So huge opportunities, and as more data becomes available and our ability to link data sets and collections improves, the new stories that we're going to be able to tell about the people and objects and places in our data are extraordinary. And I think also for the Industrial Histories project I'm working on, for example, we are piecing information together that helps you understand migrant workers who came over from Italy to work in Bradford in the UK, for example. Those stories can surface in
Mm-hmm.
ways that wouldn't have been possible to do before, because the labour and effort involved in tracking that would have been too great to do, and certainly at anything other than a very micro history level. So those are enormous opportunities there, to tell new stories from our data and identify new research questions. But I'm also, there's an ethical responsibility that comes with that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That you can tell stories about people that they would never have imagined you would be able to, and that's something I think we really should think very carefully about. And I'm also kind of struck by something that Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein say in Data Feminism
Mm-hmm.
about that move towards trying to get towards certainty and cleaning data. That the process of this is a quote, the process of cleaning and tidying data can be a destructive rather than constructive act. So we need to be careful when we're trying to tackle uncertainty that we're not losing things as well, that we keep an eye on a sense of what we had originally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree. I totally agree that this is a very important point, that, that sort of that, I don't know whether it's a trap, but it's a danger of categorization or over categorization, that you kind of, as you said, gloss over the differences and the uncertainties for the sake of, I don't know what sake, actually, for certainty, because people want to have certain answers. I don't know. I mean, we're moving into also sort of political questions that are linked to that, right? I mean, you mentioned the data feminism book. It's all about biases and structural discrimination and all that kind of thing. And of course, it would be good to have more control over the data, but then again, the question comes up: who's controlling what, and who's sort of making the decision in the field of categorization? But I think this is actually a good example for making the point that being uncertain about something can also be an asset, really, to sort of keep it open and sort of maybe provide different how possible categories within a data set. Although, of course, that makes the annotation processes and the data cleaning that much more complex. But then again, the world is complex, and maybe we should kind of try also to stick um, to that. So when we now started talking about data cleaning, do you have specific methods or theories or tools in mind that you would say help you most with dealing with that complex problem of uncertainty?
Um, Not, but I mean, I do think scalable reading is the thing that, as I said, lies at the heart of what I'm doing. But I keep coming back to the sort of more practical questions about
Mm-hmm.
process. I think that in one way we talk about process a lot in digital history and digital humanities, but in other ways, but it's often to say, oh, the data cleaning is 90%, if not more, of the work. But we don't often, with many honourable exceptions, to dig into what that really means. So I would really like to see more open discussion about the way uncertainty interacts with our research methods, because focus on the outputs does come back to that point you were saying, Silke, about presenting a clear, understandable message. And I think there are also some really interesting conversations to be had about measures of confidence
Mm-hmm.
as well, which some tools do try to give you a kind of statistical measure of confidence, the likelihood that this match is right, or that this person is that person. And I guess the flip side of measures of confidence is measures of uncertainty too. So I think tools that help to explore that without trying to put an artificial sense of accuracy. As soon as you say this is 85% likely to be true, it gives it a fixity that it doesn't really deserve to have, I think. I was working on a project with the National Archives in the UK a few years ago called Traces Through Time, which was a prosopographical project to try and link people up across their collections. And we thought about introducing in their catalogue system something that said, you're looking for this person on our records might be them. And we really, really struggled with how you could present that to people in a way that acknowledged uncertainty but didn't discourage or didn't give too much sense of confidence. So I'm sorry, I'm not really answering your question here, talking about specific tools and practices, but generally around process and talking about process. I do think there's a lot of work to be done around the testing of different tools as well, because I think another aspect of that uncertainty that comes into the work that many of us do working with multilingual sources is that the tools are still predominantly developed to work with English language texts. So you will not get results that are as, I want to say good, but that's not quite right, is it? But that are not as reliable, perhaps, as when you're working across different languages. So that's another area. And I think another kind of change in approach in web archive studies around this is focusing more on the metadata than on the data itself. That when the data is too huge and unwieldy to work with, your route into it is the metadata and derived data. That's also partly to do with copyright access as well, that working with derived data is possible in a way that working with the content itself isn't. And you can tell a huge amount about the nature of the web, for example, simply by knowing what URLs are in an archive and what they link to, and look at the shape of the web like that. And so that has been a change for me, because you immediately coming to something as a historian, you want to get in and get at the content, but that extra layer of the metadata can really give you extra context. And some wonderful research by people like Ian Milligan, who are focusing on working with metadata to understand these huge sources.
And also linking them, right? So this would lead us to the questions of linked open data or open data in general. So we could also, have another conversation on questions, chances, but also maybe challenges and pitfalls of the open data movement. But maybe I will keep that for the discussion. And I myself may ask one final question before we open up the floor. And this is not necessarily in my notes, but something that came to my mind when I listened to your last answer is, how do we arrive at the sensitivity or awareness? So what about teaching? How do we teach uncertainty, or how do we teach uncertainty tolerance? I don't know, acceptance or something. And this comes because I do some research and practical studies also on the field of data literacy. So that's maybe just to give you a hint of where I'm coming from. But do you have experience or ideas or thoughts on how do we really help people to accept or tolerate uncertainty?
It's such a challenge. It's a really interesting problem. And I think because people do like certainty, like to know that if you follow a process, you will arrive at something that you know to be true. And we can't do that all the time. And it makes communication about research difficult, I think, because any kind of public engagement or engagement with policy making, people like to have short answers, punchy solutions to things, rather than the certainly my immediate instinct is always to start qualifying something and say, well, no, that's just my view on it, or it could be something different, or and it's also, I think, I don't know if you found this, it can be challenging in multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary research projects as well, where you're working with computer scientists. And the first time I heard somebody talking about ground truth without quite understanding what they meant, it was, no, we're not looking for anything that might be considered truth. But I know they were using it in a different way. But that kind of language of how we talk about things as well, I think arriving at consensus around language can help. But in a teaching context, I think it's that underlying thing that all historians are familiar with, that everything has a bias or a point of view, and there was always a purpose behind the creation of something. Where it was produced mattered, all the context mattered, and that it is complex and difficult. But that's what makes it interesting. It's what makes it important, and it also allows you to develop your practice, I suppose. It's dealing with complex, uncertain data will make you a much better researcher, I think, than dealing with highly structured information all the time. So certainly in the humanities, again, it's very vague. It's not anything that could be actionable in a classroom, I don't think. But it's Yeah, it is about comfort. You're right. It's about comfort. It's about, it's okay if there isn't an answer to this. And in fact, that's interesting because it then sparks another question. And that leads on to another area of interest. So we're not looking for endpoints. We're looking for steps on the way, I suppose. And I think that could be a nice way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good idea also to sort of focus on the process, on the practices, and taking them with you on the day-to-day steps in research to actually make it visible how knowledge actually comes into being or comes into existence. And I think this also relates back to something you said about the measures of confidence or, what makes something valid or true. And in my digital history classes, I usually start with asking my students, how do they decide whether a YouTube video is good or bad? And it's usually about likes. But what does that tell us about validation schemes? And why is that not scientific? So, there's sort of lots of questions around that we could maybe also address in this particular field of study. But thank you so much. Oh, sorry. If you want to add something, please do.
Just very quickly on that, I think the affordances of the web and social media are really interesting in this area because they are introducing popularity as a measure of significance. And it obviously has a relationship to popularity and significance, but I do think it's introduced something different there. And very quickly, search boxes have given such a skewed view of how knowledge is created. There's this idea that you look for a single thing and you get the right answer, and we're hiding all of the complexity there. And in the interest of good user interfaces, which is it's a great thing to be aiming for, but I do wonder whether we shouldn't be introducing some of the complexity back into things, or at least making it visible.
So thank you very much for being with us this afternoon for a very exciting talk. I enjoyed it very much. I hope we can keep that conversation going because the Digital Academy in part is also about building networks. So I'm really glad that we kind of extended that particular connection. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the wonderful questions and conversation as well. And I hope the rest of your day goes well.
You also have a good afternoon, and thank you so much, Jane. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.